Pyrrhus's invasion of Sicily had seen great triumphs, including the capture of some of the island's most fortified cities. Though in his attempt to capture Lilybaeum, his situation would collapse. Most of the Sicilian cities would revolt against him, making his situation virtually untenable. In 276 BC, he would abandon the siege and begin to gather his forces at Catania, before intending to sail back to Italy. As Pyrrhus's force left the harbor, he was about to find himself in the midst of two enemy forces. A large Carthaginian naval force was anchored in the strait awaiting an ambush, and secondly, a Mamertine army of roughly 10,000 men had crossed and were waiting to ambush him near Locri. Pyrrhus was completely oblivious to this threat and had not anticipated any contest in his crossing, though as the Carthaginian ships came into view, he quickly aimed to make a dash to the allied Bruttian city of Locri. Although Pyrrhus's ship remained unharmed, the Carthaginians managed to catch a sizable portion of his navy, sinking a number and damaging up to 30. With his naval position severely weakened and what remained being blockaded inside of Locri, Pyrrhus was now forced to march his army along the coast to Tarentum. Though unknown to him, he was playing right into the hands of his enemy. The Mamertines were afraid to face Pyrrhus in the open field, after their decisive defeat in the previous year. But this time they wouldn't have to. The path consisted of river crossings, narrow passes, steep valleys, and thick forests, making a guerrilla war greatly favorable to the attackers. As Pyrrhus's army began moving north, they came under an almost constant barrage of arrows and javelins. The large army found it difficult to maneuver the terrain by itself, and with the constant harassment, the army's movement slowed to a crawl. In several points where the terrain was advantageous, the Mamertines launched small-scale attacks, further disrupting the army's order and dissolving portions into confusion and disarray. In one of these attacks, the Mamertines managed to mortally wound 2 of Pyrrhus's elephants, and managed to isolate and destroy part of his rear guard. Pyrrhus, trying to ward off attacks, began riding up and down his line, trying to stabilize and reform his men. Several times he became engaged in fights with Mamertine soldiers, and eventually one of them succeeded in knocking him from his horse and cutting his head, forcing Pyrrhus to withdraw back into the formation. As he was doing this, the Mamertines began preparing for another attack. One of them, a huge towering warrior, ran forth, far in advance of the rest, and in a bold voice challenged Pyrrhus to come out, that is, if he was still alive. This greatly angered Pyrrhus, and he quickly wheeled around. Full of wrath and smeared with blood, he charged the barbarian. Before the man could move to defend himself, Pyrrhus struck him with his sword. He was moving at such a speed and with such anger in his swing that he decapitated the man instantly. This happening right in front of the main Mamertine host terrified them, checking them from any further advance. They were amazed and confounded at Pyrrhus, and at once thought of him as a god. The terror he inflicted on the majority of the Mamertines allowed him to continue the rest of his march to Tarentum mostly unimpeded. By the time he reached the city, his army numbered around 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse, as well as about 20 elephants. While Pyrrhus had been in Sicily, the Romans had made gains against his Italian allies. Many of the cities which had revolted after Rome's defeat at Asculum had been recaptured. Furthermore, Rome had heavily fortified and garrisoned many of the border forts, making any further northern incursions difficult. By 275 BC, the Romans had mobilized both of the consular armies to fight Pyrrhus. They had also replaced their consuls, with Lucius Cornelius Caudinus in control of the southern army, which was positioned in Lucania, and Manius Curius Dentatus, who was stationed in Samnium, near the Roman city of Beneventum. Once Pyrrhus heard of the Roman army's positioning, he decided it best to try and defeat the Romans before they could unify. Pyrrhus's force was severely weakened from the multitude of long years campaigning. His Epirot contingent had grown increasingly thin, as he received less and less fresh replacements from Epirus. He figured if he could defeat the Romans in detail, it would be his best chance of victory. If the Romans were able to unify like they had at Asculum, his force would be decisively outmatched. He sent a small detachment to try and delay the southern force, while the main force marched to Beneventum. Pyrrhus's army encamped on the opposite side of a plain, across from Beneventum in the Roman camp. Pyrrhus knew that another frontal attack on the Romans would be costly, and whether he won or lost, it would most likely break the back of his army. He instead devised a plan to lead his best contingent through the woods to the south, where his army would be hidden from view, before attacking the Romans in the rear and launching his main force across the field. He had seen the strategy of attacking at dawn used to perfection. Seleucus had used it at the battles of the Tigris and Edebe, where he had managed to move his army under the cover of darkness and suddenly appear at dawn to find his enemy disoriented and unprepared. As night fell, Pyrrhus formed up the majority of his men into battle line, where they were to await the trumpet to signal their attack. Pyrrhus's best troops, including many of his Epirots and best elephants, moved through the woods. They were led by several Samnite scouts who knew the terrain. Though with the darkness, moving that large of a force through the dense forest proved a challenge. The path they attempted to follow was rough and covered in many points, which made maneuvering the large war elephants slow and difficult work, causing a large part of Pyrrhus's troops to get disconnected from the Samnite scouts. Already taking longer than expected, many of the torches now began to burn out, causing the already lost troops to be left without light. By the time dawn broke on the horizon, only a small portion of Pyrrhus's troops had arrived out of the woods. As they waited for the rest of the contingent, they were in full view of the Romans. Dentatus, soon realizing the Epirot's plan, quickly began mustering his army and descended down the slope upon the Epirots. In the confusion, Pyrrhus's main contingent still had not been signaled, and unable to see what was transpiring at the other end of the field, remained in formation next to their camp. Although more stragglers were still arriving from the forest, the Epirot troops were greatly outnumbered, and the broken ground made it harder for them to effectively use their phalanx and elephants. Eventually being driven back into the mouth of the woods, they were forced to abandon the attack and retreated back toward their camp. The Romans, not pursuing their enemy, instead aimed to fall on Pyrrhus's main contingent, which was made up mostly of Tarentines, Lucanians, and Bruttians, with cavalry on the wings and several elephants in reserve. As the two armies began to engage, Pyrrhus's defeated contingent returned to help. The number of elephants was now greatly bolstered, and although the Roman infantry made several decisive breakthroughs, they were unable to stop the elephants breaking through their own lines. With the Romans lacking any reserves, they were at once forced to retreat back to their camp. With the time now reaching around noon, the main Roman force was prepared and fully formed up for battle. With the return of their commander, they now planned on a second attack on the Epirites. Pyrrhus had reshuffled his army, placing his Epirites on the right and integrating the elephants into his front line to try and discourage any further Roman attacks. Though as the Romans topped the hill, they remained relentless. As the skirmishers began to engage, the fresh Roman light infantry began peppering the Pyrrhic troops with javelins and arrows. As the elephants began taking the brunt of this beating, they began to panic, moving back and forth and disorganizing their line. Before long, the beasts began to bolt, turning around and running back through their own infantry, trampling hundreds of their own men. With their ranks now broken and a fresh, determined enemy marching against them, the rest of Pyrrhus's army soon followed suit. The Pyrrhic army immediately retreated back to Tarentum, from where Pyrrhus, after garrisoning the city, set sail for Epirus, as he would never return to Italy. For the Romans, the victory was final. Pyrrhus was unable to sustain the replacements the Romans could, and with his abandonment of Italy, the southern tribes would all surrender to Rome. Tarentum would solely remain in defiance, up until Pyrrhus's death in 272 BC, at which, after hearing the news, would surrender to the Romans. Pyrrhus would go on to recapture most of Macedonia and lead an invasion against Sparta, where with the help of his rival Antigonus, he would be killed. The Pyrrhic Wars would prove a great war of expansion, as Rome would secure firm control of southern Italy, and the Carthaginians would soon come to be masters of Sicily. As Pyrrhus had properly predicted, the island would soon become the focal point of a series of wars between the superpowers, which would bring both to their knees and give rise to some of history's greatest generals.